Hello everyone! I've got something a little bit different this week. It's still tabletop adjacent insofar as this is a project supporting DBA, the tabletop game, but it's a little more digital. My latest project is to 3D model terrain features that can be 3D printed on an FDM 3D printer to fill out the arable terrain category for DBA 3, and specifically in my case for a Greek sort of style, since my two main armies are the Spartans and the Athenians that I painted earlier on this channel. Links are in the card. This isn't going to be by any means a full introduction to how to 3D model things or 3D print things. This is sort of a quick overview of hotkeys and methods that I used to really quickly throw together this first tile just as a proof of concept of being able to print this very small scale terrain for use in DBA. First things first, let's get some reference images. Obviously, Google image search is the first option that comes to mind and the easiest. I don't think I need to explain it here, but I did want to offer a sort of secondary option. Since I'm using Greek terrain and Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the video game, has a discovery tour mode, which lets you explore the world they've created and just get some pictures of it, I figured I'd show that off in this video. And for those of you who aren't necessarily video gamers, but are tabletop war gamers, this is a cheaper version of the Assassin's Creed game, so you can pick it up just sort of on the side for less than the price of the full game if you're interested. And I'm going to go over sort of the key presses a little more in detail than would be necessary if this is entirely video gamers watching out there. So if you are a video gamer, a lot of this is going to be obvious for you, but bear with me. In order to help you follow along, my key presses will be displayed on screen in the lower left corner, as you can see just coming up now, so that hopefully if I mention a key and you didn't quite catch it, you can see it down there. To start the discovery tour, just click on the option in the main menu, it'll load, it takes a lot longer than that, and you'll get in-game. Your mouse controls your camera, as in most video games, and WSAD control your movement as if they were a forward, backward, left, and right arrow respectively. If you hit the V key, that's Victor, you come into this bird view, and the bird view is very useful if you're trying to get reference photos out of this game. You can drive the bird around using the WSAD keys, with S pulling up and W pushing the nose down as if it were sort of inverted aircraft controls, and the spacebar, as it notes at the bottom of the screen there, increasing the speed of your birds so you can climb, descend, whatever, faster. Right-clicking lets you stop in a position and sort of zoom in, which can help you frame your pictures a little bit, and you can dive down to get fairly low to the ground and take pictures. Of course, as the individual person, the player character, you can also take pictures of lower areas down by the ground. The bird just helps you move around a little faster and scope things out ahead of time. Once you've found a position from which you want to take a picture, you can just hit the F3 button on your keyboard, and that's going to turn your view into a camera. You just point it with the mouse, move it around once again with the WSAD keys, and hit spacebar to take a photo that'll be saved locally on your computer. Doing this means that you can get really good 3D views of a whole bunch of buildings that are, if not necessarily perfectly historically accurate, definitely representative, and they sort of imply that Greek style, which is what the video game is meant for. So I think they're really good as a reference to try and lean on as well as historical material when making something like 3D terrain for a tabletop game. After all, in scale modeling, the idea is often to imply reality rather than being able to represent everything because of the small scale. The last thing I want to mention is that this allows you to move all the way around the map by hitting M for map, and then finding one of these green eagles in an area you want. For example, if you wanted to go down to Sparta in the center of Laconia, just go there, right-click on that green bird and hit yes, and you'll be teleported to a new location, which will let you take some different screenshots. So this is a really cool little nifty tool if you are into the Greek period, into ancients, for just grabbing a little bit of inspiration. Again, not necessarily historically accurate entirely, because it is designed for a video game, so especially if you look at main characters, much like a television show, they won't be garbed authentically all the time. But especially for architecture and layout of things, I find it pretty invaluable, so hopefully this helps somebody out. Moving on now to the actual modeling. I'm going to be using the program Blender. You can look it up on Google. The Blender Foundation is where it's from. It's a free application, it's fairly highly acclaimed, and I'm quite familiar with it, so this is a great option for me. It also had a major update recently that made the user interface much more accessible. For example, you now left-click to select instead of right-clicking to select, like everything else you do on a computer. So hopefully it should be a little easier for people to pick up now. In order to pull up your reference photos, just go to the folder displayed on screen now. The U there will change with your particular username. And you can find all the photos there and open them in the Windows Image Viewer. I have a second screen, so I'm going to be keeping these off to the side while I work. But for you, you can keep them wherever. The default setup in Blender has this camera and this light, and a cube in the center. I'm going to delete the camera and the light, and I'm going to use the cube. Once I've gotten rid of those, I want to change my scene scale to millimeters, which is done from the scene properties box off to the right here, and going down to units, selecting millimeters. This will help everything be in the right scale for 3D printing. Selecting my box now, I can go up to the side here to the transform tools and just set my dimensions in there exactly as I want them. Since I'm using 15mm miniatures for DBA 3, one base width is 4 centimeters, so the sides of this city, to be one base width by one base width, will be 40mm by 40mm, and I'm starting out with it at 3mm thick. That's the thickness of the bases I 3D printed for my actual miniatures. Later on I'm going to make it a little thinner just so that the terrain doesn't stick out from the ground that much. Basic camera controls are your mouse wheel to scroll in and out, middle mouse wheel to rotate the screen, and shift plus the middle mouse wheel to translate the screen from side to side. If you want to add a new shape, it's Shift A, and then you can select a mesh. Cube for me is going to be what I'm going to use mostly because I'm making buildings and stuff, and again, you can set the dimensions. The first thing I'm making here though is just a scale guide for me. So this is 0.4mm by 0.4mm by 0.3mm according to my nozzle size for my 3D printer. It's a 0.4mm nozzle, and 0.3mm being a pretty decent layer height. So what this means is things smaller than this cube probably won't print. I want to keep my shapes fairly broad to take best advantage of FDM 3D printing, which is at best a somewhat inexact science when you're dealing with small models like this anyway. FDM 3D printing is a wonderful technology, but the smaller you get, the less detail it can deliver, because it is, after all, just squirting out plastic and layering it on top of each other. The first thing I want to model is a road to divide this city block in 4. This road's going to connect to the center of each of the edges, and it'll let me connect this particular tile with future tiles that I make, thereby making this whole thing sort of modular and letting me make cities of various sizes that still look unified by a single road network. Some hotkeys to learn here are that Tab enters edit mode, that's how you edit a shape. 3 lets you select faces, those are the actual squares on the sides. 2 would be edges, which is the intersection between two faces, and 1 would be vertices, which are the corners of the shape. So 3 to select an edge, G to grab, and then you can drag things along any axis you want. The other thing I did here is I subdivided this particular road by hitting Control R, which adds some cuts. You can see here, you can scroll up or down to change the number of cuts you put in. And I can lay those cuts in using another similarly shaped model as a guide, and then I can select those individually and hit E to extrude. This pulls out another shape from a previously selected face. These are some of the really basic hotkeys you're going to want for Blender, but like I mentioned earlier, this is not going to be a comprehensive tutorial to Blender because that's maybe outside the scope of my channel, maybe not. If you're interested in an actual tutorial on sort of modeling something more in depth on Blender, then let me know and I'll look for that in the future. What I'm going to go through now is just some sort of concept and ideas that I had while I was working on this, while the footage runs in the background, and hopefully you can kind of watch what's going on and get an idea of what I was thinking, as well as over the course of this video getting an idea of the workflow that I went through. One of the biggest things I'm going to struggle with early on here as I model this is texture. FDM 3D printing, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't have that great of a resolution when you're working with really small scale stuff. So I'm trying to sort of get a feel for what textures will work. Here I'm making a cobblestone texture for the road that is about the size of the extruder guide that I made myself. So it might print. It's going to print in little Dippin' Dots, which I wasn't sure whether my printer could do. Spoiler alert, it can't, but we're going to get to confirming whether your print works or not later on. But yeah, I'm just trying this sort of stuff out and I want to see what works. I also want to give the road a little bit of a squiggle so that it's not perfectly straight. So I'm going to grab the center there, use proportional editing at the top, hit G to grab from the top, and then scroll my mouse wheel to see sort of that's the circle of how many things are going to be affected when I move whatever it is I just grabbed. You can see it gives a nice little natural squiggle while keeping the ends of the road in the center of the edges on the sides of the city block so that they'll match up with future city blocks that I design. Making the buildings here is just a case of extrusions and grabbing and moving shapes around once again. The loop cut, the Control R that I alluded to earlier when I was splitting up my road, is also very useful here for adding in extra segments if you want to have smaller details. Another thing that's useful is I for inset, which will let you drag in an inset basically into the center of a shape, which I'm going to use to hollow out a building in a minute, and I'm going to use it to make some little railings around the top of other buildings in the future, so you can kind of watch for that. Making the buildings here, I also wanted to try texturing the roofs. This was pretty small. It's smaller than my extrusion guide. I should have known it wouldn't really work. but I wanted to try it out and just see if I could get some tiles. The reality is, when I'm trying to work with something this small, I've decided not to work with a lot of detail because of the method of printing. My understanding is resin 3D printers can provide more detail, and that could be pretty fun to play with, really, at some point. But my Anycubic Photon has been non-serviceable since I got it a year ago, so I haven't been able to try out resin printers at all yet. Yeah, hopefully sometime in the future I will be able to, and I would love to get into modeling miniatures, which will be a little more involved than this, since I'm going to be going for a lot more detail on a miniature than I am on a very small, like sub 1/3000th scale city block for DBA. So that could be interesting in the future. Moving on now, though, there's a very important step that we need to cover, and that's making sure your things will print. To get your model out of Blender, you can use File, Export, and then STL. STL is a good format for 3D printing. I'm just going to blur out my actual file directory. I hope you don't mind, keeping a little privacy. But go in, select a folder, hit Save, or Export in this case, and it'll come out. You can then open that in the Windows included application, 3D Builder. Keep things at the meter scale. I was just checking millimeter here. Way too small. Keep things at the meter scale because you set your scale correctly in Blender, and then hit one or more objects are invalidly defined if you, like me, are making a sloppy model with a bunch of open faces, because it's easier and it keeps the polygon count down so that my Blender doesn't lag too much. Now I can scroll around and just make sure the file looks good in here, save it once again, and then I'm going to take it into my preferred slicer, which for me is Simplify 3D, drag that in, drop it, and I've already got my print settings laid in, so I'm just going to hit Prepare to Print, and it'll give me an idea of how it's going to print. Here I can see that the roofs, definitely the texture is utterly wasted. There's no chance that's coming out. The roads, maybe. So I'm going to keep the cobblestone, and I'm going to do a bit of a test print with it that way, after I've taken the roof texture off and just made some models that actually will work at this scale. Once again, this is a matter of taking boxes, extruding, compressing, that kind of stuff, grabbing faces, and working from within edit mode. Again, I'm trying not to get into too much detail about the actual sculpting here, and more just using this video as an idea for inspiration for people who might not have thought of doing this if you're out there, and you have an FDM 3D printer and some affinity with computers. So the actual modeling process here, I wanted to make a denser area, and I wanted to make very simple, low polygon objects that imply cool shapes, really. So I'm trying to make things look good from a distance on the tabletop without making shapes that are too complicated for my 3D printer to do. So small cut-ins on the top gave that impression of those rooftop patios that I see a lot in my reference photos. Angled roofs, of course, are just kind of interesting, and they print fairly well because it can taper itself up towards an angle even at that scale, as long as I keep things larger than my extruder guide. I'm also going to try and scatter the base with some other details, columns, trees, and little tent pavilion things like I see in the market in the Assassin's Creed Odyssey screenshots. The trees themselves are very easy to do in this case because they're not large deciduous trees. They're those tall, skinny, I believe they're cypress that are common in the Mediterranean, which means they're just printing up as needles. So as long as I keep the bottom taper vertical enough that the 3D printer is not going to have any overhangs to deal with, I can get those little trees, and I can get quite a few of them to just sort of decorate the area without making it too crowded with buildings. The little market stands also are super useful because they serve as awnings for buildings, as well as being little tents in the background, and again, not crowding the area too much with large buildings, because I want this to feel nice and airy and spacious and like a nice little spot, I guess. A decent little Mediterranean village. I also reduced my layer height a little bit to get the best possible detail and made a test print, and it came out fairly nice, I guess. There's a lot of stringy bits and stuff, but with small details, that's what I expected. The buildings were fantastic. I think they look great. The road cobblestones didn't appear, and therefore there's no impression of where the road is supposed to be, and I didn't quite like that, so I wanted to go back and redesign it, and also add just a little bit more of the trees to edit things out. I also wanted to expand the columns, because I thought if they fatten up a little bit, maybe they'll print with a little more shape. Otherwise, they're just sort of little pillars. But they just printed as little pillars anyway, so, you know, you win some, you lose some, but it still gives the right effect. Adding more trees to the area was very easy, and then going in to actually work on the road was probably the most challenging part here. I still wanted the road to be visible and have some cues as to where it's supposed to lie, but of course cobblestones weren't going to work because they were too small, and if I made larger stones I think it would have looked kind of crazy, to be honest, with these huge lumbering rocks in the way. Instead, what I ended up doing was inverting the road and using it to Boolean. That's sort of an operation where you judge the intersection between two models, in somewhat simple terms. So I just used it to cut out or hollow out the actual base, making the road a recessed road. This means that I'm going to want to texture it afterwards on the actual sort of texturing and painting side of things by adding in my baking soda, cat litter, whatever else I can find for adding it sort of dirty or ground-like texture within that road, but at least the road is clearly marked so that it'll be easy for me to mash it up with other tiles when I do assemble a larger city. With this Boolean operation now going on, I also want to keep the original model of the road so that I can use it as a guide when I'm making future tiles. So it's going to try printing that as well if I just export things the way I did last time. That isn't necessarily what I want here, because it's going to make for a pretty weird looking shape, as you can see here, moving into the actual 3D Builder program. To avoid this issue, hide the models you don't want in the upper right in the layer area, hit Ctrl-A to select everything, and hit Selection Only, that checkbox on the export panel. And it'll come out with only the items you selected, and only the visible items, which will exclude that road model that I used for cutting it out. Bring the model back into the slicer at the reduced layer height, I check everything, and I print it out, and I've got this, which is, I think, a fantastic little city block. I'm going to make lots more of these blocks. As I mentioned, the intent is to try and have one 3D printable piece of terrain for all the terrain listed into the arable category in the DBA 3 rulebook. I'm not going to make videos for all of them, obviously, because it's largely repetitive, especially since I don't intend for this to be a full Blender tutorial. Although, if you want Blender tutorials, again, I can do that. I've got the capability. If you've got any questions about how I did this, absolutely let me know. And in the end, once all these models are done, the full set of arable terrain for DBA, I will be putting it up on Patreon for any people who are subscribed on Patreon to download. So there's probably going to be some time before that happens. I do have Sun on the way any day now, which will probably delay these projects slightly. But eventually, once I've got all that terrain done as 3D models, and they're all going to be tested on my FDM 3D printers, they should be printable on any type of printer that you have at home. I'm going to put them up on Patreon, and hopefully other people can make use of them for playing a DBA. That's all I have for today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this was interesting, even though it's a bit of a deviation from the usual tabletop painting side of things. I am Jacques of all games, of course, and so I'm addressing all games and also all aspects of the games. It's a bit of a stretch, but here you go. This is just something I wanted to get into because it's a pretty low-key project that I can work on my own time while keeping not locked up in a craft room full of paint fumes, especially as I have a kid on the way. Thank you all very much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you got any questions, comments, concerns, leave them down in the comments. I'm super interested and I read them all the time. And as usual, go play some games.